Okay, here we go. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Society of American Archivists Students and New Professionals section panel presentation on starting a new position during a pandemic. I am Brenna Edwards. I am the chair for this past year and until the end of the annual meeting. And yeah, welcome. I'm glad everybody could make it. A few notes. This presentation does have the Otter AI live captioning enabled. So you can click on the link up in your top right corner to access that if you want. We also, this event is being recorded, and I think that's all the important notes. The way this will work, we have 2 live presentations, and then we have a pre-recorded presentation since one of the speakers could not be with us today. And any questions that you have, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end, and you can type them in the chat and I will make note of them and then ask them at the end. Yeah, please also feel free to use the chat to comment, talk comments to yourselves, questions. And yeah, we have 3 groups. We have our managers, those employed in precarious positions, and then our tenure track people. Sorry. And yeah, so I will pass it along, stop that sharing, and pass it along to our first group with our managers. Marcella and Michelle, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I am Marcella Huggard, and I am the Manuscripts Processing Coordinator at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library, which is part of the University of Kansas Libraries. I have with me Michelle Sweetser, who is the head of the Center for Archival Collections at Bowling Green State University. Michelle and I are going to be talking about supervising new employees during a pandemic. Next slide, please. And I'm going to start with talking about hiring a new person because that's exactly what I did. Our job ad was out in November 2020. We did 2 rounds of interviews in December 2020, and my new staff person started in February 2021. So there's always pluses and minuses to a completely virtual interview process, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. First, having a completely virtual process levels the playing field for all of your candidates. I typically hire staff positions, and my institution does not pay for travel for staff, only for faculty candidates. This means that I typically get a mix of folks who live close enough or have enough disposable income to come to campus for in-person interviews, while other folks have to or choose to do a Skype or Zoom interview. Completely virtual meant that the experience was consistent for everyone. And speaking of consistency, you should check with your human resources department if you have one, and or decide amongst yourselves as a search committee or as the hiring manager about whether you want cameras on or off during first round interviews. Back in the old days, these would be phone interviews, and I honestly might recommend that you go for cameras off. You lose some body language and other communication cues, and it might be harder to hear or understand candidates, but you'll also be removing a few layers of bias from your interview process. You might also be reducing a candidate's tech anxiety if they have any kind of Wi-Fi or other internet issues. Speaking of tech issues, just know that you are going to run into them during the interview process. Be patient and give your candidates grace, and give yourself grace too if you are the one having the issues. I think being all virtual sped up the interview process for us. Like I said, we conducted 2 rounds of interviews in December before the winter holidays. I had a couple reasons for wanting to move quickly, even though I kind of felt like I shot myself in the foot. I was afraid that the search committee would forget things because we had the entire week off between Christmas and New Year's. And I also really wanted to reduce candidates' anxiety about whether or not they got the job, if there was going to be another interview, and all those other considerations. Speaking of which, I don't care if you're doing a virtual or in-person or hybrid interview process. Always be as transparent about your process and your timeline as you can be. Acknowledge that as a hiring manager, you might not have total control over the timeline, particularly if you work in an academic or governmental or corporate or other bureaucracy. Again, this can help ease candidates' concerns and anxiety, and transparency is always a good thing. Once our new staff person accepted the job, I scheduled a virtual tour with her. something that I would have normally done in person. So I showed her how to get into our building. It's a little weird getting into our building, the processing area, the break room, all those kinds of things. You're always communicating with a new staff person before they start, giving them the info they need for their first day. And there was even more of that communication than usual in this case because of things like, hey, here's how you sign up to get a COVID test, because you have to do that before you can come on campus. Next slide, please. So typically the first day includes a building tour where you walk the new person around and introduce them to every single person you can find, and they're completely overwhelmed and can't remember anybody's names, right? Well, I obviously could not do that in this case. So instead I set up 30-minute Zoom calls throughout that first week with each of the teams in the building: curatorial, conservation, public services. This way our new staff person could see everyone's faces, everybody who could attend those meetings without their masks on. They could talk a little bit about what they do so she could get a sense of how her work would fit in. And it wasn't one ginormous staff meeting of everyone. But of course, she still couldn't remember names because it was still the first week and she was still overwhelmed. KU Libraries has a really great orientation mentorship program, and the person who coordinates it usually assigns one mentor to each new employee. I asked her to assign two mentors in this case, one inside Spencer and one who works at another library on campus. This way, our new staff person can meet somebody else in the community and from within the larger library system. But she would also have somebody else inside Spencer she could talk to about Spencer's collections and works. That person was also able to help her apartment hunt a little because she'd moved to Lawrence much more recently than me. So she also used to be a KU student. So she could direct her new staff person away from student traps, and they all drink until 3 a.m. in that place and those kinds of things. Knowledge that I definitely did not have. And of course, our new staff person was moving to Lawrence sight unseen. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle because she also wanted to talk about mentoring.
I wanted to emphasize the importance of mentoring, not just for work kinds of things, particularly in pandemic times when you're probably going to have to provide more support to your new hire, kind of as a friend and colleague than just on the work kinds of things. You know, they can't get out, they can't meet new people, they haven't gotten to know the community, and maybe haven't even set up their new home in the way that they might like. So you should, as a supervisor, allow time for this, build time for that casual conversation about the broader life in your one-to-one meetings or your check-ins or throughout the day in person by dropping by if that's where you are, or figuring out a way to do that in an online virtual environment as well. Keeping in mind those needs of the whole person, not just their needs at work, and fitting that within kind of the culture of your organization and the preferences, your own preferences, as well as the preferences of any other teammates who might be involved in that kind of mentoring. Training is obviously very, very important for all new hires, and the pandemic provided any number of challenges to that. I had the opportunity to hire two individuals shortly prior to the pandemic, so they had some time in the office before we transitioned to remote. And so I think there are some unique kinds of challenges with that transition, and we need to keep in mind that each person is going to react differently to those transitions, kind of based on their personalities, but also their needs and their work duties as well. So my two recent hires had about 6 weeks of experience and then about 3 months. And if you think about the amount that you learn and know about an organization and one's duties, it changes exponentially between 6 weeks and 3 months, right? So the support that you provide to your new hires and the training it really needs to be customized to where they are and what their needs are. And you need to ask them what they need. And then relatedly, you need to also work to manage expectations, yours as a supervisor, those as a new hire, and those of their peers. So, as a supervisor, as you're transitioning, to a different working environment, keeping in mind that your training plan is going to, just go out the window, right? If you relied on hands-on training for certain kinds of skills or tasks, you're going to need to spend time developing documentation for those tasks. You might also want to review existing documentation to ensure that it reflects current practices, because your remote employees are going to rely on that even more so than they probably would have if you were in person. You should also expect that you're going to spend more time with your new hires in the remote environment, just as you would have really in an in-person environment. But the things that you might be covering are going to change to reflect the kind of new needs. You need to work with your new hires to establish priorities for work that can be done in this, the changing circumstances. And then also recognize that your new hires are going to want to work independently. And they may express frustration to you about things that maybe are beyond your control. They just need to vent, or they've, come across old documentation, did things in, kind of outdated ways, and now are kind of having to redo work, right? So just expect that as a supervisor, and know that it isn't necessarily directed at you, and that your new hire needs an avenue to vent. In terms of helping your new hire manage their expectations, you want them to know that their work is, as you transition to remote, likely to center more around developing knowledge, and maybe less output focused than that of their peers, and helping to normalize that. And as a supervisor, looking for projects where they can contribute and have wins that distinguish themselves in a way that is beyond just learning mode. Your new hires are likely to notice that they're taking more of your personal time than their peers. Helping them understand that that's expected and normal is important, just as emphasizing, as you would in person, that they aren't expected to know everything, and helping to serve as a sounding board for them as requests and emails come in, helping them to understand institutional priorities and unwritten rules, and then modeling decision-making for them, so that you can talk about the processes you would use in making decisions, so that they can then apply it and become more confident in making decisions on their own moving forward. For peers, I think it's really important during transition times like this to emphasize to them that their new hire colleagues may need to come to them more than usual. They may have more questions because things maybe aren't documented, and you want to situate that in the context of the pandemic and remind them that it's not a reflection of the individual hire's skills and qualifications. That's really important. And then, just as we had that transition process out of the office, there are transitions back into the office and considerations for supervisors. I think how your individual workplace kind of constituted work is likely to have an impact on what that looked like. In my case, we had a pod system. And so I intentionally chose to schedule myself to be at work on the same days as my new hires, so that we could continue to build those relationships, and that they definitely had the support that they needed. That meant that some of my other hires did not have the same access to me. It also meant that I became even more so the person that provided certain kinds of training because I was physically there. And so allaying their concerns, again, about disrupting me as the supervisor, was really important. Retraining, if you did some training before leaving, is really important, because there are certain kinds of tasks that they likely haven't engaged in for many months, say like in the use of a scanner. And so you need to review your training plan and schedule time to maybe go over some of the things that they had already done. Arrange for those additional training sessions. Speak with those who are likely to assist in that, so they understand it's not the staffer's fault, and recognize that while we might think of many of the retraining things as being tech-based, it could also be kind of physically based sorts of things, like how to navigate your building, where to find a certain unit or person, where the mail is, for example, those kinds of things that didn't necessarily get ingrained before they departed the building. And then finally, helping them to understand that shift in goals as you're back into the office. What are the important things now, and again, that you're back in the building, and make sure that they understand that they aren't going to be penalized if they aren't maybe meeting goals that were articulated before the pandemic even happened. And then I think it's also really important to help them understand how this year's calendar might have looked different from other years' calendars. On an academic campus, things tend to be cyclical. So what are the things that didn't happen last year that might normally happen, and helping them anticipate those, and then also understand what did they do this last year that that was an aberration. Don't expect that in the future. And Marcella is going to talk now a little bit about hybrid training during the pandemic.
Yeah, so when my new staff person started, we were already back in the office on a hybrid situation, 50% on site and 50% working from home. So a surprising amount of training can in fact be done virtually when you've got the documentation to do it. We use Archivist as our collection management system, so screen sharing was our friend. Talking about work from home projects was also super easy to do when we were both working from home. But of course, bright and early, first thing Monday morning, her first day of work, she and I were both on campus so that she could pick up her new work laptop and monitor that she would need to work from home. And I scheduled IT to come over to talk her through how to log into the VPN, make sure she had all the programs that she needed on the new equipment, all that kind of thing that's a lot easier to do in person, even if you're socially distanced, rather than trying to do it remotely later. One thing that you want to set expectations around right away is scheduling. And you also, as the supervisor, want to be upfront about your own work schedule. I've been fortunate in that I've been able to stick to an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday schedule during the pandemic for the most part. So I asked my new staff person to stick to something similar, at least to start with, so that if she had an urgent issue, like she couldn't log into archive space or something else wasn't working on her new laptop, I'd be able to help troubleshoot. I don't check work email after I'm done working for the day. That's a work-life balance thing for me. Also, a reminder to my fellow supervisors during this tumultuous time, be extra patient and forgiving. I typically train sequentially so that new staff learn how we process collections now in the 21st century. After they've worked at Spencer for a few months, I'll give them a legacy collection to work with so that they have that context already in place. I didn't have that luxury in this case because my new employee needed to work on stuff from home, which meant that she was getting twice as much information on top of new information, on top of starting a new job in a new city during a pandemic. So just be aware that you might have to give a few extra reminders. It's okay. I think frequent and immediate feedback is even more important in a virtual or hybrid environment anyway, because it's not like you can necessarily drop by each other's desks and check in or ask questions. I've also taken to giving email feedback much more frequently than verbal feedback for this reason, and also so that she can refer back to things more easily. Like, oh, that's the information that I need to put into that note, or that's how I do that piece of the workflow. Next slide, please. So speaking of communication, I set up daily 15-minute one-on-one check-ins with my new staff person for her first month or so. That is not normally something that I would do, but I wanted to make sure that she had a dedicated, quiet space to ask questions. These were Zoom calls when we were both working from home rather than in the middle of the processing area where there might be other staff around. So she could ask questions, I could give verbal feedback, we could do some screen sharing, we could talk about timesheets, whatever she needed. It was on both our calendars so that nobody would schedule other meetings with either of us. Sometimes they took more than 15 minutes, way more. Sometimes they took way less, especially as that first month wore on and she got more into her groove. Also, one more thing, supervisors, think about what your communication style preferences are. And remember that you are allowed as a supervisor to have preferences. My staff all have my cell phone number, but they only use it in emergencies for things like, I can't come in tomorrow morning, I got to take my cat to the vet. I am happy to communicate via Skype, IM, MS Teams, Zoom, phone call, email, whatever the case may be, but I don't like staff using my personal cell phone on a regular basis. Again, that's a work-life balance thing for me. So I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to wrap up and talk a little bit more about communication.
Yeah, another reminder to fellow supervisors that it's really important to help your new hires understand norms around communicating with others within your organization and outside your organization. You need to help them understand and have opportunities to ask about who are the important people that I need to reply to immediately. You know, who are the people who need to be copied on messages or know about what's going on, and what are the norms at my new institution. So you need to build time in and workflows in so that you have a chance to kind of provide that story behind the email, or the kind of like the meeting before the meeting, because the last thing you want is your new hire going into a meeting completely blind, particularly when it extends beyond your kind of individual unit or team. And then also, I think it's really important to have a conversation around what might be acceptable norms during like pandemic times, say how quickly one responds to an external patron in response to a reference request and what the delivery might be for that, versus what is the normal kind of communication style, what are our normal operating practices, and facilitating an understanding of that so that they are in line with and know what to expect in terms of those delivery timeframes. So that's a super quick overview to some of the considerations of supervising during a pandemic. Marcella and I are happy to answer your questions at the end. Also, our contact information is here. We'd be happy to receive emails from you at any time. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you, Michelle and Marcella. And now we're going to hear from our precariously employed group.
Good morning and good morning. Yes, still morning on the Pacific side. We are a group of your student and new professionals who come together. Basically, we are all precariously employed. And even though I have this small win to celebrate, my contract was renewed, it's still only a one-year contract. So we're here to kind of talk to you guys about the in-between and how awkward it can get. My name is Cara DeSimone. I am on my ending my first contract with the National Park Service as an archives technician in Tallahassee, Florida. And everybody's just going to do a real quick introduction.
My name is Marissa Friedman. I'm a digital project archivist at UC Berkeley in California. And I started my 2-year grant-funded position in October of 2020.
My name is Lourdes Johnson. I am one of the student chapter coordinators at SNAP section. I graduated from San Jose State University in December of 2019, and I started my first internship remotely at the Library of Congress around September 2020.
My name is Hope Ketchum-Deating, and I am also student chapter coordinator with SNAP. I'm employed at Duke University in the Research Services Department. I oversee our digitization workflow, and I am wrapping up my MLIS currently at the University of Alabama.
So as we met to develop this quick panel, we had some themes that developed. We did all kind of graduate around similar times. We did kind of start within a similar time frame. And this dog is really just kind of embodies it's like our spirit being. We have no idea what we're doing, but we're doing it. So some of the specific things that came out of our conversations were interviewing remotely and other hurdles, some of the struggles with virtual onboarding and training, navigating and re-navigating, in some cases, remote and hybrid responsibilities, how to fight imposter syndrome, because that's something that we all kind of have a problem with, vocational awe and whatnot. Thank you, Helena. Building a virtual community in and beyond the workplace, which is part of what we're doing with this, and how to plan around precarity when everything is moving and shaking and you're stuck in limbo. It can be fun, I promise.
regarding the interviewing remotely, we share our challenges. The ones that we faced where it became difficult to adapt to virtual interviewing formats, for example, via Zoom, which at times I found it disorienting, and we agree on that. Could be awkward and distracting a bit. Also, we struggle to meet the technological requirements, such having a strong Wi-Fi signal in the proper professional spaces. The time of the hiring process was very lengthy. It took months. Personally, it took like more than 6 months for me to hear from someone. And then everybody was going virtually at the same time for the first time. So that was a first for everyone. So there were a lot of connectivity issues, just especially if you work for the government or a federal job. Basically, that's like a system designed to work more in a more insular way for security reasons. So there were a lot of connectivity issues. But what we learned overall is that during the search job process, if possible, it's worth reaching out to someone that you may know within the institution that you're applying for, so you can gather information prior to your interview. Practice over the phone and virtual interviewing with a friend, a colleague. Even better, if you become a student member of SAA, you will have access now to the Career Commons services. So you can practice virtual interviewing, mock-up interviews, and you can get feedback reviewing your resume. So I wish I had that before, because that was like last year. So I think this is new. This was launched this year. So that's awesome. That's great. So take advantage of that. And lastly, be very patient, because if you're applying for a federal government job within academia, the hiring process and the timelines are very, very long. And so be mindful of that and be flexible. The payoff is wonderful. So with that, I'll hand it over to Marisa.
So I spent the first 3 months of my 2-year position working entirely remotely, which also meant that my onboarding was entirely virtual, except for a brief visit to campus with my supervisor to pick up like a work laptop and get a very abbreviated tour. Because this was a novel experience, both for myself and for my supervisor, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and lessons learned and just the general experience of that. When you're in a term limited position, you may feel pressure to sort of hit the ground running, right? Because you have project goals and deadlines, and those are looming. But it's really important, especially in a remote onboarding environment, to take your time, getting to understand the organization, its existing technological environment, human resource ecosystem, and even your core job responsibilities, because it may just take longer to make sense of those things in a virtual environment. So just, having some patience with that and recognizing that that's going to be a challenge. Org charts are definitely your friend, particularly if you're in a big institution. This was the most complex institution that I've ever worked at starting at this job. So I think that, making sense of using those org charts to help you match sort of department roles and functions and titles, particularly if you can't get the complete physical tour to meet people and meet them face to face and see the space. My supervisor also organized Zoom meetings with various units in the library, which was a great help during my initial first 2 weeks of just kind of breaking those barriers down. You may find that existing documentation is insufficient or doesn't cover what you need, particularly if you arrive in the midst of staffing shortages or system changes, which I did. So just making a note of this and trying to fill in some of those gaps yourself can be really useful. It's useful to employers who are seeking feedback on their remote training process, because this is new for them too. And it's also really helpful for updating existing documentation. So as you're learning and noting what needs to be updated, just making sure that you're documenting that. And then connecting with library IT or the department in charge of desk and tech support early on will really help avoid future headaches when you need something and can't access it. Obviously you can't anticipate everything, as I'll talk about a little bit more, but certainly connecting with them early on will avoid future headaches, because it'll almost certainly happen at least once, usually when least convenient. And then, we've talked about this a little bit, but I think maintaining regular communication with supervisors and colleagues can be probably the most challenging part of remote onboarding. And staffing shortages in your department can make it more difficult to access institutional knowledge and resources. So it's definitely okay to request additional information, time, or communication with your supervisor throughout your training in order to make sure you have what you need to do your job, while also respecting the express preferences or methods of virtual communication among your new colleagues. So asking questions and establishing a regular pattern of communications with your supervisor and being proactive about that really can be crucial to your early success, I've found, in a remote environment. And just remember, you're not needy or an imposter. You're just trying to learn how to do your job in circumstances that, frankly, are extenuating for all of us, your supervisor included. So how did we navigate our new jobs in light of the pandemic? Some challenges obviously emerged. In some cases, the shift from in-person to remote to hybrid scheduling or back to in-person resulted in a sort of recalibration of job responsibilities and workflows, which could be stressful and anxiety producing. These varying work environments may have required additional accommodations as the need arose, such as work equipment and appropriate VPN, server, software access, all of those things. And figuring out how to make your home space conducive for remote work is not necessarily easy for early career professionals and students, especially for those balancing the financial and logistical pressures of just having moved to a brand new area, or you may have roommates, or whatever the reason may be. For me, I lived in a very tiny studio when I started my remote job. So it was a challenge figuring out how to make a workable workspace out of that. And limited or inconsistent remote access to resources, information, your physical workplace, your colleagues, and potentially IT support early on can also run the risk of intensifying a new professional's sense of imposter syndrome, and definitely can add pressure to precariously employed archivists who already may feel pressure to deliver results and prepare for a potential new job search in a year or two. So the return to campus, either hybrid or full-time on site, can be disorienting too, because it feels like you're starting all over again and relearning your job within a different context. But ultimately, I think with sufficient institutional support and sort of a willingness to learn and adapt, those conditions can also offer opportunities for creativity, flexibility, and a lot of professional growth.
Some of what we learned, and to give a little background too on my position, I started before the pandemic, but very quickly shifted to online work. So some of my perspective too is just how is it one starting, having only a couple months in your position before you're sent to remote work, but also navigating being a new professional, being at a new institution, and now on top of that, navigating very shifting responsibilities, and how do you document that and navigate that with your supervisor? So some of what we've learned and just taken away as a whole is just that kindness, both with yourself and others, goes a really long way. And I know I've heard that a lot from my supervisors and department heads this year. I hope many of you have as well. But we're navigating a new normal that doesn't feel very new anymore after being here for over a year. But I think in many ways, we'll be navigating a different type of new normal as we return to different capacities of on-site work this fall, different levels of student and patron return. So just continued patience with yourself and others. The other thing that really I hope is a theme throughout the entire presentation as well is reviewing your job responsibilities early and often with your supervisor. Duke this year did something that I really appreciated. As a part of our end of year evaluation, we went over our entire job descriptions with our supervisor and amended changes that, you know, were very evidently going to be long-term, and just made sure that like the work we had been doing had really been recorded adequately and was persisting with us. Not to say in addition to our existing job duties, but shifting things around if it seemed that our position was really going to be shifting, and making sure that was formally documented. So that kind of gets to the second point as well. Just document what you're doing, make sure it's being accounted for. I know this year as well, many of us have had more professional development opportunities than we can really keep up with. If you're not at that point yet, great. If you are, I also encourage you to seek out a mentor, someone to talk to as you navigate this. SAA has a great mentorship program. I've really enjoyed working with the mentor I've had, and I found that resource just to be really helpful as I've navigated these new changes. And that kind of leads to my last point of advocating for yourself. I think the mentorship as well has really helped me to know when I need to advocate for myself, when something feels normal, when I need to speak up to my supervisor, and having someone walk alongside you with that has been really helpful as well. Next slide. So some of what we also wanted to talk about are the challenges of building virtual community if you are starting your position virtually or shortly after. And for myself, I feel fortunate because I was able to meet all of my colleagues, unlike most of the people on this panel hadn't even met their colleagues before the pandemic began. But I really formed my working relationships and had to define and nurture them virtually as I really completed my first year over Zoom. So the first thing, just forming relationships, it can be very hard virtually, as many of us know, not just with our colleagues, but with our family and our friends, and maintaining relationships that way. One thing many of us enjoyed was Zoom coffee chats. They can go farther than you think when you're missing out on those everyday interactions at the water cooler or wherever you run into your colleagues. Another piece of advice that I found really helpful is just to learn how your colleagues communicate and what they prefer. And there's some really great surveys out there that you can send to your team or your colleagues to see what their preference is. So is it Slack? Is it a quick Zoom call? Is it email? Do they enjoy informal catch up over Slack? Does that distract them? This is something that really went a long way, making sure my team was communicating positively and getting along and being effective at the same time. Mentors and colleagues I touched on in my previous slide, but again, definitely encourage that as building virtual community both inside and outside of your organization. And finally, state regulated groups. Many of them are looking for quote unquote new blood to keep their projects going. It can be a great CV bullet point if you're a new professional or if you're not. And it's a chance to further network and meet people in often, a low stakes environment.
So planning around precarity is very difficult. And in some ways, I've kind of been doing this for the past 5 years straight. So I guess I've gotten kind of good at it. Never stop looking, especially when you're in this limbo of like, yes, my bills are paid right now, but what happens in 6 months? So always kind of be on the lookout and keep your ear to the ground, metaphorically, about new opportunities that may be coming your way, or something that maybe is archival related, but maybe not necessarily in your what you would consider your normal field of expertise. For example, I work for an archaeological center, and this is my introduction to archaeology, is digging through their records. So to plan around precarity, the best advice I can give you is to just always look ahead and to always kind of be planning a couple next steps ahead of yourself. Moving during a pandemic is twice as stressful, at least twice. Coming into this new city with no family and no, social support, it's very difficult. But It can be done. You can do it. We can all do it. Following the leads with your regional organizations, your state organizations can be immensely helpful. And for me, that was reflected with the AWEF or AWFund group. I seriously, strongly credit some mentors and colleagues in that organizing committee as helping me have the confidence and get used to the archival field, so that I feel like I know what I'm doing, at least enough to have the conversation with my supervisor and go, well, you don't know what you're doing. I don't either, but we'll figure it out. So when you are trying to maybe, extend these contracts or advocate for, maybe you need somebody here to do this full time, and this is the work that I've done. We are having, as archivists, we are doing a lot of advocacy and not instructing, but kind of explaining or defending our purpose. I hate to use the word defending, but justifying our existence in institutions, unfortunately. So don't be afraid to speak up and ask for what you need. And I think we're going to close up here with, I believe it's Hope. No.
Thanks. So the conclusion, definitely these are uncertain times. Remember that employers are as nervous and anxious as you are. We're all going along with these new normals and looking into the new horizon. Networking is emotional support, not just professional. And a bit of advice for our fellow early career professionals: virtual communication is labor intensive, so set boundaries and respect the boundaries of others. So in spite of this, there are disparities, inequities in the profession and barriers to entry, structural and individual workplace challenges, and the support that early careers archivists face may have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I'm reading this, we all know that, so I don't want to go over and over, but overall, I feel like the key word is advocacy and outreach. And I think in our field, we are the masters in advocacy and outreach. So remember that, and you're not alone. You just need to reach out and ask for help, support. And I personally, I'm an introvert, and I started reaching out to virtual communities within our field, and I found that very, very interesting people, a good community, supported community. So we want you to, to do the same, and we're all here together. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to who's next.
Great, thank you guys. I do want to mention that our pre-recorded session will put us right to time, but I do encourage you that if you are available, please stay for the Q&A portion of this, and it will be recorded if you are not able to stay. I just wanted to make note of that, and now I'm going to pass it to Helena so she can share the video.
Welcome to the Tenure Track Archivist Positions section of Starting a New Position During a Pandemic. We hope this section will give you a sense of what new professional archivists and tenure track positions have experienced this past year. And for those of you who have shared experiences, we hope you find comfort that you are not alone. But before we deep dive into our talk, we wanted to include the third member of our group, Abra Schooner, University Archivist and Records Manager at Trinity University, who could not continue this project with us. The pandemic has impacted us newbies in a unique way, where many of our colleagues close to retirement have left or are leaving their institutions now. This leaves us to manage collection, supervise, and add to the growing list of other duties as assigned suddenly. Abra made the smart decision to not overwork herself, as two of her colleagues retired a few months ago.
Hello, my name is Helena Egbert. I am currently the processing archivist at Kansas State University. I began my position from Oregon in April of 2020. I moved to Kansas in July of 2020. Previously, I worked at Oregon State University in successive levels of responsibility as an intern, student employee, and temporary grant-funded staff member. I primarily worked doing processing and reference. Until I moved to Kansas last year, I'd lived on the West Coast in Oregon nearly my entire life.
Hi, my name is Renee Rapp. I was hired in April 2020 as the Scholarly Communications Librarian and Archivist at SUNY Maritime College in Throgs Neck, New York. Maritime College is a small merchant marine college of about 1,600 undergraduate students, and the archives is located in the Stephen B. Luce Library of Fort Schuyler. While I'm one of 6 new tenure track librarians on staff, I am the only archivist. And while my primary position isn't archives, I frequently collaborate with my colleagues with inventory projects, display cases, designs, and reference requests. Now that you have met the archivist, it's time to visit the archives, or at least view a few pictures online.
In addition to starting my position right as the global pandemic kicked off, K-State's entire library was and is still recovering from a fire in their building from 2018. Due to this fire, everything was moved out of the library, including all of the archival material. Much of my work has been devoted to planning and implementing the return of K-State's archival material back into our stacks. The challenges of this task have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Often my struggle of beginning a new position during a pandemic is inescapably intertwined with also undertaking disaster recovery, something I have, of course, not trained in. My first year has been anything but ordinary.
While these photos show the beautiful architecture of the fort, collapsible shelving, and a sneak peek into the collections, the archives is an intellectual mess in desperate need of reorganizing. What you do not see in the photo is the entire college archives records group being reprocessed completely, which were also entirely artificial collections created by librarians in the 1960s. 2 collections from the Special Collections Records group are also on permanent loan with many restrictions and take up about half of the space, and 2 finicky archival and content management systems that haven't been touched in 3 years. What a hell of an updating job. We were hired in the year of interrupted transitions. Unbeknownst to us, the pandemic would force us to work from home and navigate the archives without a map. We had to let go of our expectations and get a grip with reality.
Due to the circumstances I entered under, I had no idea what to expect. When I accepted my job, I knew that I wouldn't be working in the library because of ongoing disaster recovery. I had not, however, anticipated there would be a worldwide pandemic a few weeks later. I had anticipated that I would work with my coworkers in person on a regular basis. It has only been in the past month or so that I have met the majority of my coworkers in person. I also anticipated a lot more of my department would actively be working on disaster recovery with me. I think I underestimated what a large role I would play in disaster recovery, regardless of the pandemic. But because of the pandemic, I lacked and sometimes still feel a lack of camaraderie with my department while enduring this time. Due to the fact I have only worked in one other archive before, I had vague, unexamined, and unconscious assumptions about how different aspects of the K-State archives would be the same as my previous institution. I quickly learned collection management practices I assumed would be more widespread, such as how closely locations on material is documented, how accessions are created and described, and other details like that are not uniform across all institutions. I still run into moments of readjusting my perspective regularly. At times, breaking these assumptions have led to overwhelming realizations of the amount of work I will have to do to move everything back into the building and document where it is and what it is so it can be found later.
At Maritime, I had expected to work alone, processing a huge backlog of records and collections that would take an entire career to finish. Instead, working remotely for the first 6 months, I had only scratched the surface of unfinished projects. What I thought was mostly continuing the reprocessing project turned out to be much more. Before I was hired, there had not been a professional archivist for 3 years. I not only had to reorganize the entire archives, but I was also left with unfinished projects. And not to speak ill of a fellow archivist, they had a lot on their plates as a lone archivist. Unfortunately, this meant they also left incomplete projects. And this task of picking up where someone else started over 3 years ago was daunting, to say the least. By the summer, Maritime allowed for some in-person work 2 to 3 times a week with permission from the campus. This was my only chance to get a head start on what projects I was tackling. The picture on the left shows what the archives looked like then. empty boxes on top of a map case, 3 carts of miscellaneous collections, and hundreds of custom-built enclosures from a grant project stored in the boxes on the right. The picture on the right is a cart I found outside of the climate-controlled archives room with moldy collections that were meant to be thrown out years ago. Without much paperwork, I decided to keep the moldy records in a different room. While it doesn't feel like I got anything done, over the summer I found out the numbering system for the collections and the stacks, which no one in the library could understand, and found previous archivist records from past projects. I had the roadmaps to incomplete projects and was slowly picking them back up. This may sound like an understatement. However, we both learned the value and importance of physically being in the archives. While many archives were able to transition from remote work focusing on digital collections and updating documents, not all of us could do the same task typically done on location.
It probably isn't hard to guess, but being a processing archivist during disaster recovery when you've never laid eyes or hands on the collections before is very hard. Archivists put a great deal of admirable work into describing collections and trying to make them accessible to users. I think we underestimate how much human understanding that can't be duplicated we store in our heads about our space and our collections. For example, with access to collections, most archives employees sort of know a lot of inward-facing institutional knowledge. Examples include offhand comments like, "Oh, that collection is a mess," or "Those collections are requested a lot," or "That collection isn't processed, but it's all stored along that one range." All of this information seems trivial, but when one stops to consider the amount of information each institution internally shares, and then consider trying to piece it together without the physicality of the space or collections to solidify these understandings, the amount of insider knowledge becomes clear.
Helena makes a great point about institutional memory and internal information. For me, it was difficult to realize the extent of the intellectual mess and leftover projects when the only time I walked into the archives was during my interview in March 2020. By the time I was hired, New York City and New York State had completely shut down. And at the time I lived close to the library director, so we met at a Target parking lot to hand off my work-assigned laptop and 2 half Hollinger boxes she pulled randomly off a shelf. Not only was I working remotely for the first time, I was figuring out the archives remotely as well, with 2 random boxes and access to a shared folder titled Archives. For me, processing a collection is part detective work and part mind reader as you try to answer so many questions about the creators. Browsing through the archives folder was like processing a collection, and it was meta trying to think like another archivist. I had some idea of what was going on, but I had zero context of where the records were, their conditions, how they were used, or even what they were. Not to mention, I didn't know a thing about maritime history. Working remotely for me was browsing the archives folder in the shared drive, trying to understand what had happened, what needed to happen, and what was incomplete. It was incredibly confusing and intimidating, filling the shoes of someone who had done so much and was relied on at the college. I also trained for the other half of my job, scholarly communications librarian, through tons of webinars. Needless to say, it was information overload from both sides of my position. Not only was it a struggle to understand our archivist interrupted positions, we were also struggling with pandemic-driven isolation from friends, family, and our new colleagues.
When I accepted my job, I knew I'd be moving away from the area of the country I felt at home in, but I hadn't planned on moving during such an isolating time. Due to the pandemic, until recently, I've been fairly isolated from most people. It is impossible to isolate moving for just a job from the impact of losing so much community and social support, or the ability to start recreating it for what has been a full year. This is still very hard for me, and I think it will take another year or so to quote unquote recover from. Building community and finding non-work friends takes time and effort. Figuring out what that looks like in a half-vaccinated community is complicated and not straightforward.
I believe one of the most important pieces of starting a new position is the work environment, specifically colleagues and support staff. However, this was difficult for those of us who started remotely. The last in-person contact I had was in that Target parking lot on my first day for about 6 months. The only time I met my colleagues was during the interview the month prior, which doesn't count because we were all on our best behavior. And while we were all struggling with remote work, I think we were also struggling with severe isolation from friends, family, and each other. Our director began weekly meetings to catch us up on project progress, planning virtual library services, professional development, and updating LibGuides. However, there was no water cooler or space for us to talk about non-work things. And to be fair, with the state shutdown, there wasn't much to talk about. So I started virtual happy hours once a week. For a while, it was something we all looked forward to, and we were able to talk about binge watching TV shows, past travels, and ourselves in general. And as the college reopened in the summer and completely reopened in the fall, we had to transition to a socially distant water cooler, but it felt like starting over again. Today, we are still testing those personal boundaries with new CDC guidelines. I hope I can speak for the both of us when I say we were prepared to become archivists, but not entirely sure what tenure track meant for us. It's something they don't teach you in grad school.
Working towards receiving tenure can be stressful even under ideal circumstances. At Kansas State University, within the library, every pre-tenure individual is judged by a committee of all of their fellow tenured librarians every single year. This means I create a portfolio describing my accomplishments, give a short talk on my accomplishments, and answer questions from my tenured peers. I turned in my first portfolio last winter after working only around 8 months. As I mentioned before, due to the pandemic, I had barely met any of my colleagues, so I had concerns about being judged by people who didn't know me or my work very well. Ultimately, I am happy to report the experience interacting and receiving feedback from my peers was overall very positive. Another ongoing element of being an archivist working towards tenure in the library is that a lot of librarians aren't very familiar with archives or how they work.
Not only were librarians and faculty transitioning to remote work, the administration and HR departments were doing the same. Many of us in academia understand the mountains of paperwork that goes into running a college. However, much of that paperwork is physical paper requiring signatures across departments and campus. And while the campus was fully remote in the summer, HR had to process contract renewals in a different way. All annual reports are due in June, and even though I started in April, I had to write out everything I had done in only 3 months and use that paperwork in my contract renewal that was requested months in advance with no indication as to why. My colleagues and I are all new, being hired between June 2019 and April 2020, so none of us had any clue what to expect in our contract renewals. Unfortunately, neither did HR, so there was no guidance from the college. With our vague library matrix in hand and an old annual report from a librarian over 8 years ago, we frantically typed out our reports and crossed our fingers that they passed. It took months for the paperwork to get through the committees and provost's office, longer than usual, and many of us were not sure if our contracts would be renewed. That adds to my imposter syndrome in a very bad way. The big elephant in the room for all new hires is imposter syndrome. You'd think a pandemic and working remotely would eliminate something so personal and yet shared by everyone. Unfortunately, being isolated does not deter imposter syndrome.
It has been hard not to ask myself, is it imposter syndrome if I really don't know what I'm doing? Disaster recovery has fanned the flames of my imposter syndrome. My supervisor regularly reminds me that regardless of my experience as a processing archivist prior to this position, beginning a position under these circumstances, it would all still be unknown no matter what. Returning to working in person has also fanned these doubts in the recent months. I am still adapting to a new building and in-person culture. Additionally, my supervision responsibilities have begun in earnest. I supervise 2 students and a full-time employee. Prior to this position, I had done only very limited supervision, so supervision in person continues to be a large adjustment for me. Even though I don't really feel it a lot of times, I'm trying to be hopeful that this will get easier as time goes on and I will stop feeling like a fraud who took a job that they don't know how to do.
Maritime was fully remote in spring and summer 2020, so the imposter syndrome was intense because the environment was intense. The feeling of am I good enough with no one to talk to is difficult. And with the entire college remote, no one knew how to transition faculty meetings, paperwork, and other everyday things to a virtual setting. By fall 2020, the campus and library was open, but not to the public. This was unusual for other SUNY colleges, but our college is small and our program requires hands-on experience as merchant marines. As I got to meet my colleagues again and met other faculty members, the feeling of the first day came back, like a second first day. Even though I had over 6 months of getting to know the archives from the archives folder, I was really getting to know the archives and more unfinished projects. Again, we had a transition back to in-person after being remote, and many policies and procedures were different under COVID guidelines. So while I got to work in person with some colleagues, there was still a need to be distant and work alone. And some days I would go all day without talking or seeing anyone. After a full academic year in person with campus COVID policies changing, the imposter syndrome has mostly gone away. I realized this past year none of us had the answers, and it was okay to say, I don't know, and ask for help. Or maybe I'm just numb to the chaos. And I think these Leslie Note memes from Parks and Rec sum up imposter syndrome pretty well. With all of what we talked about in mind, we want to conclude our presentation to encourage everyone to practice empathy. As we all recover from the pandemic fatigue, we need to keep in mind that there are other new archivists and new hirees like us who are still recovering. Helene and I have different experiences. However, we both struggled through the hiring process and starting process during the pandemic. We are still recovering from imposter syndrome and learning more about our positions. As we continue to adjust to the new normal personally, we are realigning our goals that can help us fill the gap created by a year of working remotely. For me, that is not focusing on reprocessing the collection, but instead focusing on completing past projects and archival outreach to the college and public users.
A bright shining light for me is that disaster recovery and the pandemic hopefully can't last forever. I'm looking forward to having everything move back into the building and begin the not so small task of processing an extensive backlog. While I'm sure this task will have its own challenges, I like to think they will be ones I feel equipped for. Thank you all for listening to our talk, and feel free to reach us and ask us any questions you have.
Great, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you to all of our panelists who spoke today. Round of applause. Yay. So we're going to go for about 5 to 10 more minutes to allow for any questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, or feel free to come off mic or come on mic, unmute yourself and ask. To start, we have one from Ariel Petrovic. I'm going to try not to butcher everybody's names. She said her experience in her new position has been very similar to Renee's. Any tips or resources for loan arrangers who are overwhelmed with unfinished projects and the need for new policies and procedures? Renee is not able to join us currently, but if anybody else wants to tackle that question, please feel free to.
I think one thing to think about is how to prioritize all those unfinished projects and what seems most important to you as the new person who doesn't have the institutional knowledge. So if it is something like there's an inventory and there was this grant and there were these other things, what do you need to do your job most effectively?
That's really close to what I would advise. I'm very much in the same situation, kind of coming in blind and catching up with an institution that has had no permanent archivist for, I think, 3 to 5 years. And being project funded helps you focus, because you look at it as, this is my scope, this is what I'm paid here to do. Everything else is extra, pardon my puppy. And so it kind of ends up for me being, well, what can I do? What can I actually contribute? And if there's something that I don't know how to handle, well, I can just make a note of it and set it aside and bring it up the next time I've got a meeting.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Caitlin Griffith. Have you all noticed a decline in job postings because of the pandemic? If so, do you expect more opportunities to come up now that more institutions are reopening? Anybody can take that question.
I was just going to say, I do. I think it will be slow. I'm actually not precariously employed, but I am in more of an entry level position as I'm finishing up grad school. So I feel like my eyes are on the job market, and I can definitely say I've seen more openings. I know that at least here at Duke, our positions were, frozen for almost a year, and now we have quite a few openings. Check them out. But I feel like they will, but it will be slow, and it will probably be very in keeping with the field as a whole, high level of applicants, and still very limited positions. But I do think it's promising that we're at least beginning to see some positions open up again.
And I would just add that, our institution had some retirements as a part of the, this whole process, which has then caused internal conversation about how we might reorganize, how we might rethink about doing work. And we will have positions that open, but we need to kind of settle on what is the new organization going to look like before those postings happen. And I suspect we're not alone in kind of taking some time to do that work. So it's slow, but I do think that the positions will open.
Great. there is also some great discussion happening in the chat if you don't have chat open. Lots of tales about how some hiring freezes, chills are being lifted. Yeah, are there any more questions? Does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question? If nobody else has any questions, we will go ahead and end this meeting so everybody can go to eat lunch for about most of us probably. Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for coming. We do have a Snapchat tonight about neutrality and activist archivist on Twitter at Snap Section. But yes, thank you again to our panelists. You all were great. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Have a good day.